Welcome back. This is our second lecture in child psychology. In this lecture, we're going to look at the biological basis and the physiological basis of the brain. So we're going to look at, the structure of the neurons, some of the terminology for describing the brain, and also why the brain is kind of a very plastic organ as it develops over time, and particularly how it is influenced at certain critical periods in the child's development. So with that being said, let's turn to our agenda. So in this lecture, what we're going to look at is the biological and physiological structure of the brain. So we're going to define things like, the neurons and the glia and the various components of the neurons in the brain. The second thing we're going to address is why the brain's wiring and pruning are important, which means that not simply the brain is just growing in terms of just getting denser and developing more and more nerve cells and more brain cells over time. There's also a process of, let's say, wiring in a particular way, but also in a way that where it's editing and emphasizing certain connections over others. And finally, we're going to look at how does the brain develop for the child at key stages of child development. So the point is that the brain is more receptive to developing certain skills and certain knowledge at different periods during child development, because the brain is either in a critical or sensitive period, and if that period is not, let's say, if the stimulation does not come during that period, child's brain might not develop, and you could say maybe in a normal manner. So let's look at some of the basic things. The first one is that what's really amazing is just how many cells. And one of the things I've said before in my psychology class is that the brain is one of the unexplored frontiers: outer space, the deep sea, and the inner brain, which we really don't understand it because it's so vast. So a full-term baby at birth has 100 billion brain cells. And even despite that, having 100 billion brain cells, it's still the least developed organ at birth in the human body. And also the rate of change is that 250,000 brain cells are developed each minute over the course of development. So the thing is that it's growing very rapidly, despite being very big and very vast, and all these different connections is a little bit beyond most humans' comprehension. So there's two types of brain cells. The first one you probably heard of before are called neurons, and these are what transmit the chemical and electrical impulses from the brain along the central nervous system and out to the motor, both taking in senses from the environment, but also sending out signals to the various parts of the body, whether it's the internal organs or whether it's the muscles that allow for, let's say, motor function. What you probably haven't heard of is the glia, and these are kind of everything else that kind of goes around the neurons, and these are kind of the supporting tissue that support things like cell maintenance. And so when the neurons become damaged or the neurons have, let's say, dead matter, they clean that out. And actually, this is most of the brain. It's about 90% of all brain cells. And just to kind of get an idea of what it is, this little chart here on the lower left kind of shows you what a typical neuron looks like. And the key things are the dendrites, which are kind of, let's say, little trees that stick out. And then and there you kind of have the eye and the nucleus, and there's a cell body there which contains the genetic material of the nerve cell. And then you have this long trunk that goes onto the axon terminal. So the way that the electrical or chemical impulse is transmitted is from the dendrites, probably from another nerve cell, neuron, down the trunk and then to the axon, and then there's going to be a synapse where there's a gap, and then there'll be another transfer to the next thing. And you can see along this trunk, there's kind of a myelin sheath, and we'll describe what that is later. The glial cells are kind of like all these different things. They're the most important is probably the myelin that coats the axon, but there's also other things that give the neuron structure, hold them in place, kind of carry out the maintenance of the cells for the nerve cells. And so they're just as important, because if some of these things, some of the glial cells break down, particularly myelin, the brain neurons won't function as efficiently, and they might not function as well. And so it's important that you know that these are also these other cells in the brain and also in the central nervous system. So there are three types of neurons. The first type of neuron are sensory neurons, and these are neurons that transfer messages from the environment to the central nervous system, which I'm going to abbreviate in the slides as CNS. And these are things like that come in from the senses. So, something like the optical nerve for the visual messages, sense of touch, hearing, smell, etc. And they're taking in information from the environment and then giving that to the central nervous system to process. The second type of neuron are motor neurons, and these are ones that transfer info from the central nervous system, meaning the brain and the spinal column, to the environment, which means they either give the environment, meaning that it could be the organs of the body, it could be the muscles, and basically things that, like, if you get a certain impulse or you get a certain message from the environment, then you want a certain reaction to it. So, like, for example, if you touch a hot plate, you're going to have, like, say, an impulse sent to the muscles in the arm to kind of pull back. And lastly, you have the interneurons, which are the ones that process and transfer info within the central nervous system. So these are the ones that, in a sense, take the messages and make sense of them, and then communicate with other neurons. So those are the ones you might find largely in the brain, but also maybe in the spinal column as well. So the structure of the neuron, and we kind of went over this before. There's three things that I want you to know: the cell body, dendrites, and axons. The cell body is what contains the genetic information, the proteins, for the cell to fix itself and also the cell to reproduce itself. It's down here, kind of on the left-hand side, and you can see the arrow pointing to the kind of purplish things surrounding the nucleus, and that's what we would call the cell body. The dendrites are these little arms that stick out from the cell body, and dendrites refers to meaning a tree. And they look like little trees, and they're short, bushy cables that they receive signals, which means dendrites are getting information from either from another nerve cell or from from the terminal receptors. And the message is going to be, so they're basically input function. They're going to take the message, they're going to send it down kind of like this cable, the axon, and at the axon terminal, and the axons are, of course, axis like the axle of a wheel, axle of a car, or the axis that that you rotate around, and they're long, thick cables that transmit the messages and ultimately to their terminals, and that's kind of like the output function. They're taking the information and sending it along the line. So one thing about this is the wiring. The neural network of fibers in the brain is what we're going to refer to generally as wiring. And there are parts of your brain that are permanently wired at birth in order to sustain life. So these are things that govern breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, your reflexes, digestion, excretion, basically bodily functions that you do not really think about. Like, you don't really think about breathing for most of the time. You don't think about making your heart pump. You don't really think about digestion. It just kind of happens kind of in a passive way. And the reason why these are permanently wired, because you don't want these to change, and so they're kind of running the automatic functions of the body. But the remaining wiring of the brain is what you may call plastic or tentative, which means it's not permanent, and in a sense the brain is reshaping itself in response to the environment and in response to experiences. And this is one thing why, while the permanently wired part of the brain is kind of shared across a lot of different individuals, what makes individuals unique is that, based upon their experiences and based upon, let's say, the environment they're in, their brains might be formed a little bit differently, which means that the plastic, which doesn't refer to plastic, the material, but kind of the ability to bend and mold itself, is that the brain can remake itself or reorganize itself. So part of this is the gap. You have this architecture, and you have all these neurons kind of, in a sense, arrangement. And what's between the neurons are these synapses, which are these gaps. And then over these gaps are sent chemical and electrical signals, which leaves from the axon terminal and jumps to the synapse to a dendrite of another neuron. And this process of jumping this gap here, jumping over the synapse, is called firing. So when it goes from the axon to the dendrite, we're going to say that the nerve cell is fired or firing. And what you sometimes see is, like, when you see these brain scans, is you talk about the firing of different, let's say, parts of the brain, which means that the part of that brain is active and it's functioning and sending information. So just some graphics, and just to show you kind of how wiring is, and this shows you the density of the wiring or the synapses in the brain at different stages. So you can see a newborn, it's not very dense at all. You have a lot more gaps, and you can see how dense it gets over from 1 month to 9 months to 2 years. And this is when the brain is developing. So we talked about 250,000 nerve cells a minute are being created. And what happens is that brain goes from, not very low functioning, functioning is not really necessarily the right term, but not really capable of doing a lot of things, to one that's a lot more denser. And what you see a little bit is you kind of see the pruning process or the strengthening process of different wiring, is you see some of these connections get thicker as, like darker black lines in terms of the synapses, particularly at 2 years in adults. And that means that certain connections are getting favored because they're getting used more, and therefore it's interpreting it as those are more important, and then other ones are less important. So that's what we're going to call pruning, and we'll get more to that in a subsequent slide. So part of this is that, it's a use it or lose it. So as you use certain parts of your brain, those connections become stronger, and the brain realizes those are important. This is also one reason why when you're in a particularly good mood, or when you're excited, or when you're kind of in a zone, you learn more, because what's happening is that is telling the brain that this is important, and as a result, it's going to, in a sense, strengthen those connections, and it's going to weaken connections that are not getting the same reaction. And so, in part, is when we talk about memory later on, this is part of the reason why, let's say, memory works better when you're, in a sense, in an aroused or excited or an interested state. So, just to get back to the kind of the firing and just kind of close in, well, if you look here in this diagram of a neuron, what you're going to see is what happens at the axon dendrite. And what happens is that there's a neurotransmitter molecule that goes from, let's say, the axon branches into the dendrites, and then it's picked up there. And this is what over the synapses, this gap in between, and the transfer of, let's say, the neurotransmitters from the vesicles, these little sacs that either have a chemical or conduct an electrical impulse across this gap, the synaptic gap, synapsis gap, is what's causing, let's say, the transfer of information along the nervous system. So the next thing that I think is important here is pruning. So if there are connections that are either seldom used or not used at all, they get pruned, which means that they basically become weaker, and they become, let's say, less important, and other ones are becoming more important. And so the principle here is kind of a use it or lose it. If you use certain parts of your brains, if you practice things, they're going to become stronger. If you don't use parts of your brain, or you don't really practice some skills, they're going to become a little more flabby, and therefore they're not going to develop at the same rate, and you're not going to have the connections. So the things that we use a lot, the connections become stronger. Sometimes it's kind of related to the idea of muscle memory, the idea that if you do repetitions, that your kind of certain motor skills are being deepened, and that's kind of part of the pruning process that I'm trying to get at here. So by pruning, or let's say kind of getting rid of certain connections, what it does is it allows the connections that are being used to get stronger, and as a result, those connections become faster and more efficient. And these allow the brain to fire more quickly and send signals more quickly. So the brain is trying to, in a sense, cut away the parts that are not needed to focus on and give them the most attention, and give, let's say, the strongest connections to the ones that are being used a lot. So what is on, let's say, these, one thing, just because it's related to the speed by which messages are sent over the neurons, is the myelin sheathing, which is it's a glia cell. It is a fatty substance. You can think of it as, like, say, either like electrical tape or the sheath along an electrical wire that keeps, let's say, the current or the electrical impulse within, let's say, the wire itself, and not, let's say, a short circuit. And what happens very often is, as myelin breaks down, this is kind of a cause of a lot of not so much in children, but in terms of older people, the breakdown of the myelin is one thing that leads to kind of senility, or the loss of some of the connections that have been there for most of their adult life. So what the myelin does is it insulates these axons, and it cushions the neurons. And without the myelin, the speed of the signal would be about 30 times slower than it is in a normal human brain. So one thing here, and this is, I think, what's really fascinating, is that the brain is plastic, which means the brain is not set, in the sense that once it's made, once it's mature, that is what it is, and it doesn't change over time. Unlike some other major organs, which some of them can regenerate, but most other major organs, when they're done, they're done. The brain is able to change or adapt to environment, and what this quality is called is plasticity, which means, once again, it's not like plastic, the material, but in the sense that plastic is bendable. plasticity refers to the ability of the brain to adapt and change in response to things in its environment and in response to its experiences, which means that the brain can make up for some lost function. So if you have some damage to some part of your brain, what will happen is the damaged neurons are not, you can't regenerate neurons, you can't regenerate brain cells, but what will happen is the nearby cells to the ones that are damaged will adapt and they will take on some of the function of the damaged cells. So your brain is having, let's say, multiple parallel wirings, which means if one goes down, another one goes up, and this makes the brain quite robust. And so when you lose some functions, and you see this sometimes when people have damage and they're rehabilitating, what they're basically doing is building up, let's say, the muscle memory of different parts of the brain to take over the function for what might have been lost due to an injury to the brain or to an injury to another part of the body that impacts the brain. So I think one important thing here is that there's some critical development windows. So even though the brain is adaptable over time, it's not in the sense that it's always adaptable the same way at all periods of time, which means is that some certain periods in time the brain seems ready to learn certain things, and in these windows it really needs a stimulation that's going to support that. So what this is saying is that even though it's adaptable and even though it can recover from some loss, timing is important, and there's two types of periods in the wiring of the brain. The first one are critical periods, and critical periods where that there's some part of the body is vulnerable, and if it has a lack of stimulation or has a negative stimulation, this can be really bad for the brain. So the point about this is that it's kind of in sometimes the transition periods, and if something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to, or if there's something interrupting that, it might have a long-term impact in how the brain develops. Now, the other type of period are sensitive periods, and sensitive periods are saying that there are certain peak times when the brain wants stimulation, and these are the best times to be able to wire for specific knowledge or skills or abilities. And so there are certain windows of time that are more sensitive. So certain times when you might develop speech, sometimes you might develop motor skills, sometimes when you might develop like emotional skills. And if there is some type of interruption there, it might have a much longer impact than just, let's say, a loss of time. So one thing that I've mentioned before is the development of speech and language. And this is one reason why doctors are so concerned with ear infections, is because an ear infection can kind of muffle the sound in your ear, and if you don't hear something at a certain time, you're not going to be able to hear the sounds that are necessary to develop speech. And that's one reason why, all children get ear infections because they have low immunity. But one reason why ear infections are much more critical in a child than they would be in an adult is that it's not just about the pain or the irritation to the child, is that it muffles the sound and the child can't pick up the sound. As a result, the brain is not going to respond to the stimuli from the auditory environment. So what's the difference between a sensitive and critical period, I think is well summarized in this table, is that in a sensitive period, it means that the brain is ready, which means it's going to be even more sensitive to stimulation from the outside. And when that period is done, you can still learn something, but it will be less efficient. And a key thing about this is like learning a second language. The earlier you learn a second language, the more likely you are to become fluent in a short period of time. The older when you start learning a second language, so in my case, I started learning Japanese when I was in late high school, early undergraduate, and college. As a result, it took me a lot more time to get to fluency than if I had been exposed to that language at a much younger age. Critical periods means that you need certain stimuli to develop a particular skill, and if you don't have the stimuli or there's some interruption to the stimuli, the area is allocated for the particular skill will move on and then get allocated or get applied to a different type of function, and as a result that skill won't develop or that knowledge won't develop. So one of these is about visual capabilities. So this is something that happens from where your vision becomes a lot more like your current vision, more of an adult vision, and this is about 8 months to 3 years. So the basic thing is that you need kind of some visual stimuli during those periods. If you had an interruption, like you had a damage to your eyes, or you had some disease or infection in your eyes, it could affect your long-term, let's say, visual development. So just graphically thinking about this is a way of thinking about critical periods is that um, there are different levels of plasticity to the brain at different times. And you see these kind of little like parabola curves here, and you can see age on the x-axis and plasticity on the y-axis. And what you're seeing is that here are some different skills, and at different ages, you're going to see the plasticity of the brain, the ability to mold and learn and respond to stimuli in those skills peaking and then dropping off, and then maybe a different skill coming up and peaking and dropping off, and you have subsequent several of these in a row. If you look on the right-hand side, you're going to see the sensitivity to a variety of different skills, such as developing a number sense, peer social skills, um, understanding of symbols, development of language, emotional control, vision, hearing. And you can see that this, 1 to 3, the toddler age, is a really critical period where the brain is very sensitive to developing of skills. And after about 3, 4 years old, as they kind of get to the preschool, social skills become more important. Language is still very important. Developing number sense is important, but you see some of the more automatic things, emotional control, vision, and hearing, so the more physiological skills have already kind of peaked and kind of moved on by the time you were 4 years old. So what this leads us to some critical development windows. If you know what these windows are, if you're a parent or your teacher working with a child, what you're able to do is then kind of, in a sense, set up certain stimulations for the child that are going to, let's say, take advantage of these windows of opportunities when your mind is highly plastic, to give it certain type of stimulation. So reading to a child, talking to a child, bright colors, practicing motor skills such as walking, standing up, and things of that sort. And so a window of opportunity is this prime period for developing a particular skill. But if there's a deficit of the right stimulation within these given time frames, it also can be a window of vulnerability, which means if they're not stimulated at those periods of times, they might never develop the skills, or they might develop those skills. It might take a lot more effort to build what is a normal level of the skill or knowledge that's being targeted. So this is pretty straightforward. We've talked about some of the biological basis, such as we described the structure of neurons and glia in the brain. We've talked about how the brain is plastic and how wiring, which means some things that are permanent, and how the density of synapses develops over time during child development, but also what's going on, the importance of this pruning process, which means that if something is not being used, if something is not being stimulated, it's going to get kind of downplayed, and it's going to in favor of other ones that are getting more stimulation. And so we've also talked about some critical periods, and particularly the difference between a sensitive period, one where it's optimal to, let's say, because of the sensitivity, the stimulation is going to have, let's say, a much bigger impact than outside of the sensitive period, and a critical period where if something is not developed, the brain is basically going to reallocate the brain space and then, kind of move on past the skill. So that's it for now. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about different types of knowledge and different types of skills that are developed. And this is going to be, once again, just like most of our lectures at this point, mostly definitional, mostly laying out some of the lay of the land. But I look forward to seeing you next time, and I'll see you all in class.